So welcome to the Dharma time. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Yoga Sutras, and I will ring the bell. We'll have a short period of silence, and then we'll dive into the discussion. So just as the bell goes to silence, so to invite your mind to become still. You could imagine the mind becoming still, like when the ripples on the water become very still and the water reflective. Of course, it's very common that even though you invite the mind to be still, its habits are still very active. And it may be helpful to you to either actually visualize ripples on the water becoming still, or to give your thinking mind a place to land, something very tangible in the here and now, such as the direct experience you're having of your hands in this moment. Should you choose to observe direct experience, do so without judgment, without a narrative or a story. Observe direct experience for the opportunity to be simply present to this moment. Notice yourself noticing. And if your mind is distracted, kindly bring it back to either visualizing the ripples on the water becoming still, or bring it back to noticing the direct experience of your hands, your fingers and your thumbs. Thank you for the quiet period. You are welcome to open your eyes when you're ready to do so. And please make yourself comfortable. So how many of you experienced lucid, clear, reflective minds? Undistracted? No mental riffraff? For those listening on the internet, no one's raising their hand. So if you're listening later on the internet, know that you're not alone. I think it's helpful to understand there are many ways people define yoga, and I'm going to give a few definitions. I invite you to contribute as well. Jay and Tanya can also. Yoga is described as equanimity in action, one way that it's translated. It's also translated as love, the experience of love and homecoming, or grace. If love is too strong a word, yoga is sometimes translated to be union back with that innate sense of love, compassion, or grace. We might in that case say that yoga is like remembering, that already exists. We might then even say that yoga is the process of not forgetting. Of course, conditioning causes forgetfulness. The way the mind is clouded arises out of conditioning and life experience, and then we get into what I'll talk about, the 5 kinds of knowing, where we forget what yoga actually is. We forget who we actually are in our essence. Yoga has also been defined as selfless service, and understanding that life is coming through you in a particular expression, and it has a desire to express itself through you uniquely. And the process is letting that be selfless, like you're discovering it as it's happening. This is sometimes referred to as your dharma as well, understanding what your personal dharma is. Not one that you write your bio about, one that's writing itself through you. And yoga's been described as the experience of devotion. In this case, devotion means devotion like ongoing loyalty, admiration, gratitude, and appreciation for the preciousness of life itself. So given all those different definitions of yoga, what might you add to the list of definitions yourself? Tanya and Jay, and you can contribute if you'd like to. What's that?
Said you covered a lot of territory there.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Molly?
You kind of touched on it, but in an interview, there was something you said that I liked the way you said it. You talked about that yoga doesn't try to add anything to you, that it more works to subtract things that get in the way of, the grace or the love or you don't try to put Zen on top of, frantic energy or anxiety. You kind of work to start to diffuse or subtract what is causing that.
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on it, but I just liked that phrasing quite a bit.
Yeah, in fact, sometimes I like to say the process of awakening is much more about remembering and then not forgetting, and more about subtracting, not adding. We might have to add life skills so we can figure out how to subtract. But we're not adding like you'd add to your resume or your accomplishments. We're not adding like you'll have to become a brighter, more beautiful, more intellectually astounding individual. We're actually subtracting the urge to be somebody other than who you are, which means remembering and recognizing that we are becoming who we are all the time when we're not getting in our own way. Otherwise, we're becoming a derivation of who we were meant to be. And those derivations become symptoms that are painful. The word derivation, I mean to imply that when you're out of alignment with yourself in any particular way, that's a sign that you're getting distorted, not more clear. So the symptoms that tell you you're out of alignment are to be thanked. Thank you for arising, painful elbow, or sleepless night, or road rage. Thank you for telling me I'm out of alignment right now. I think one thing that Western mind does a lot, and I'm only going to speak through Western mind because I have a Western mind and Western mind conditioning, but what it does when road rage shows up is it then decides that it's bad as a person. Like your personhood has now become bad. Or if pain or sleeplessness arises, we start labeling ourselves as this condition and forgetting that we are much bigger than any condition or symptom arising at all. So then our symptoms and our distorted expressions become a chance to label, blame, judge, or shame further. And then you have added a lot onto who you could have been. You have this sort of quote-unquote unpacking of all that to find out who you were meant to be. That'll keep you busy for a while, which is great if you want to be busy. It keeps us employed also. So I say that with great affection, but I really love the part of the psychosocial spiritual journey that is yoga therapy. I love the part where we aren't so occupied with the riffraff, and we're actually on that horizon where you start to feel the swell of life becoming more amazing than you imagined it could be. And now we're stewarding that process, rather than only stewarding just the scrapes on the knee that happen mentally every day and every week. This is not to say that the symptoms go away and then we're better. The symptoms may abate, and then there's this other immense journey that opens up for us, called the spiritual life, through yoga. And that's where Patanjali was writing the Yoga Sutras, to direct us to that possibility. So I was saying prior to us getting together that he wrote them backwards, and that the second Yoga Sutra says Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means yoga is the cessation, the restriction, the ending, the abating of the fluctuations, the movements of the mind. So when I first heard that, as I was reading the Yoga Sutras by myself in Cambridge, Massachusetts, without any tutorship, I read the second Yoga Sutra in some bookstore somewhere, and I promptly closed and did not purchase that book, because I couldn't imagine that the cessations of the fluctuations of the mind were going to occur. I just thought, no, I have a busy mind and it's not going to happen, and I don't know what this guy's talking about, so this is not my book. And I probably went to pick up a book on nurturing your inner child. This was in the late 80s, so there was a big bookshelf for those things as well. And I looked at this yoga philosophy, and I looked at this other book, and it seemed a lot more friendly. So I closed the Yoga Sutras and walked away. Fortunately, I came back to the Yoga Sutras later, and I was given wise mentorship as to how to read them. So in the first sutra, Patanjali does say, now the conversation about yoga is going to begin. And when he says now, which is actually the first word in the whole sutra, in the whole book, now the conversation will begin, he's actually implying that we've done some preparation. We've put some things in place in life that now we can have the attention for this conversation, which is a really precious conversation to be having. Because in the second sutra he does say it's possible that you're going to experience grace, expansiveness, immense mental silence that allows room for love to come through. That's how I would translate Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, that when the mental stuff gets out of the way, what shines through is love or grace. In the next sutra, which is like calling them sentences, they're like little sentences, the next sutra says, and then the seer abides in his or her own essence. That means that, and then the one whose mind has become really quiet and tranquil right there experiences their essence. You're steeping in it like tea. It's already steeped. The tea bag is in the hot water. There you are. You're realized. Fortunately, he then says, well, at all other times, other stuff is probably happening. And what he means by the other stuff is the vrittis, the mental fluctuations, are probably happening. So if you think about the surface of the water, and let's say it's a relatively shallow body of water, like a puddle, it doesn't take a lot to disturb that puddle. It doesn't take much to make it muddied or distorted or disrupted or rippled. And the ripples may last a relatively short or long time, but it doesn't take much to get it going again. So that shallow body of water is actually more disturbable. A deeper body of water may have more stillness underneath the surface. So the top can get rippled, and beneath there can be a quality of depth and quiet. I'm lucky to have been introduced to swimming at a really early age, and I'm absolutely comfortable in the water. And scuba diving also. So you can go down at this, when you're at the surface of the water, you hear all the other voices and the swimming pool mayhem of the town pool, and all the chaos and the kids running and screaming and the lifeguard whistles, and then you go down, and that becomes muddled. can't hear it so much. And then you go further down into the 10-foot area and it's really quiet. And if you've been lucky to go scuba diving, while the scuba apparatus has a certain noise, the ocean underneath there is really awesome and quiet. There's a mental stillness that overcomes you in that environment. So yoga is partly the process of deepening the water in which we're living. I would hypothesize that each of us was actually born with a relatively deep body of water, but how did it get shallow? Layers upon layers upon layers of conditioning. So conditioning comes in, think of it like a sandbar, and then another layer of sand, and then another layer of the sandbar, and it keeps coming in, so that you have less and less deep water, more and more shallow water, and therefore more disturbable. And when that gets disturbed, it kicks up the mud from the bottom and makes it very hard to see clearly. Do you understand this analogy? It's okay. Have you experienced your life at times feeling like deeper or more shallow water? More disturbable, less disturbable? What are your hypotheses as to why sometimes it's less disturbable and other times it's more disturbable?
Meditation.
Meditation makes it more disturbable? Less. Mm-hmm. What are your other hypotheses about that?
It makes me think of the conversations we had about the ventral vagal nervous system and how that kind of expands your resiliency or kind of increase your capacity for before you hit a breaking point in your nervous system. So that sort of reminds me of it.
Mm-hmm. So one hypothesis is that meditation helps make the water less disturbable. And another is that the state of your nervous system reflects whether or not you're going to be more or less disturbable also. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah. And then it's the process of deepening the water may also be the process of that vagal toning that you talk about
Yeah.
so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are your other hypotheses as to why sometimes you're more agitated, other times you have more equanimity?
Oh, I know I'm more able to be agitated when I've had a crisis in my life, an external event happen.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take much at that point.
Yeah. So we could ask, how much am I navigating? Or how burdened is my system right now? What do I have to take care of? What am I ingesting, not just food, but mentally? And how am I processing that? And is it just too much for the system to stay resilient? And then you add a crisis, and it's likely to be more disturbable, like the water got shallow because we added burdens underneath the surface, and then there they are. I know you said external, but to go with the analogy, those burdens are just gathering up underneath, and we're less likely to maintain our equanimity. Mm-hmm. What else?
Out of balance Ayurvedically,
Mm-hmm.
like the heat.
Yeah. So if you are in circumstances and or you place yourself in circumstances where your constitution is going out of balance, and if we're doing that consistently enough, we will experience ourselves as living in more disturbable water. We're more agitated. Yeah. And the way each constitution gets agitated is slightly different. So Pitta more frustrated, more externally obvious. The other two have their own unique way of doing. Yeah. You said heat, so I'm going with Pitta. Yeah.
Well, I notice that this heat makes me agitated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's why somebody asked me recently, I'm working with the officers, and they said, are the prisons air conditioned? I said, absolutely, they're air conditioned. It's been proven to prevent some of the unnecessary violence. The prison is air conditioned. Because heat is a way that people rouse their own agitation, and you can torture people with too much heat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What are your other hypotheses?
Poor diet.
What is it?
Poor diet.
Uh-huh.
Like going days on end with eating, pizza and cake and
Mm-hmm.
things that taste really good. Not to say that healthy food doesn't taste good. It tastes good too, but sometimes,
Yeah. Yeah. So what you've done, though, when you're eating some foods that aren't optimal for you, is you've, again, burdened the system underneath. Right? So it's now trying to process something that your gut-brain axis might not appreciate, or your digestion might not do so well with, Or you might have your own story about how these are bad foods and those are good foods, and now the burden is the story we're telling about the bad food we've ingested and what we have to do about it to make up for having been quote-unquote bad. So those burdens can be physiological and psychological and mental as well. Yeah. And Jessica?
I think a lot has to do with beliefs. So if I believe that I can handle this, I feel calmer.
Yeah.
If I believe I can't handle this, then I'm just easily frazzled, or beliefs about the situation that it'll pass,
or that it won't pass, or it's
pass,
just or
right.
it's unjust,
Mm-hmm.
it's ethical or it's unethical. It shouldn't be happening, but it is happening. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So how we relate to the circumstances and what we believe about it and ourselves also makes us more or less disturbable or clear. Yeah. And so what the Yoga Sutras are saying at this juncture is there are aspects of mind and states of mind that if we understand, we can navigate better. And one of the most important things that they talk about in the sutras is what they call uncoloring. It means uncoloring thought, like uncoloring a belief, uncoloring a thought about a good food or a bad food, uncoloring the conditioning that we are so habituated to. It's very difficult, once you have enough conditioning, it's very difficult to uncolor it without the help of others. I always recommend we have a wise guide or a community that we're practicing with, because the leopard believes in its own spots. The zebra believes in its own stripes. We believe in what we believe about ourselves, and we can easily convince ourselves that what we're thinking is real. As in, I'm a bad person, and that's real. Or I can handle it, or I can't handle it, and that's real. And yet our thoughts have been colored for a long time. The question that we ask in the Yoga Sutras is, how colored are they? So what Patanjali says next in this period of the sutras is, there are 5 ways that we know things. And understanding those 5 ways of knowing is really helpful. And isn't it amazing that they could distill it down to 5? Particularly, let me just give a nod to this for those who haven't read much about yoga or yoga philosophy. 5 is a really important number in yoga. There are 5 ways of knowing, 5 mind states, 5 causes of suffering, 5 vayus, that's energy centers, 5 koshas, 5 layers of the human experience, 5 yamas and 5 niyamas, 5 brothers in the Bhagavad Gita, 5, 5, 5. They must have been committed to the number 5 and then started inserting, there are 5 things. But let's use it because it's distilled enough that you can count them on one hand. There's also 5 organs of action and 5 senses and so on. Isn't that fascinating?
But also 3, right?
3 is an important number as well. Yeah, like the tripod of yoga, Kriya Yoga has 3 aspects, and then if you take
the gunas.
3 gunas and 3 doshas, and they turn out to be 9, and the number 3 becomes a number 108, which is the sacred number of the universe, because
Are they
divided.
related, the 5 and the 3, or no? No.
Well, there's 5 elements, and the 3 doshas are made of the 5 elements. So, yeah, there's some overlap in there. I'm not a numerologist, so I'll have to ask. Maybe my friend Chris Canaris could tell us about that. So with this 5, I said you can count it on one hand. So there are 5 ways of knowing, and they include fantasy, memory, deep sleep, misperception, and clear perception. Now, I've talked about this before, but I want to unpack it a little bit, because of those 5, they're all potentially useful. But the most important one is clear perception. Let's talk about the potential usefulness of the other 4 that don't seem so useful when you hear fantasy, memory, misperception, and deep sleep. So fantasy, the unhelpful side of fantasy is that you're living in a daydream. You're living in a story you're telling yourself about the way things are, about who you are, about who you could become, or how life is going to unfold. So living in that fantasy, that's quite painful sometimes, and other times keeps you in the spell of what's about to happen. So it pulls people towards the future more often. And daydreaming is not a particularly helpful way to go through life. However, the capacity to fantasize is also linked to problem solving and visualizing. So if we don't have the capacity for some visualizing, like I can see myself having more skill, I can visualize myself having a more stable life, I can visualize the ripples on the water becoming clear. And what I see in my mind is very powerful as to what happens to my brain. If you see yourself meditating as a disaster, your brain will register that you think you're a disastrous meditator. But if you see yourself meditating until the ripples become clear on the water, your brain starts to pick up on that possibility. If you visualize a quiet, beautiful sunset, rather than the noise of the neighbor's leaf blower or wood chipper, which we had for hours this morning at our house, but you visualize something that could create peace or stillness or kindness, it actually affects your brain. So it can be helpful to know that fantasy in the form of visualization is powerful. We also have to be able to fantasize to solve some problems. We benefit right now from the problem solving of generations of humans, like the wheel, the refrigerator, the air conditioning. Somebody had to come up with that. Titanium hips. I benefit from that one specifically. So we benefit from fantasy, but we ought not live in it as an unconscious state. If you're going to use fantasy or visualizing, just know that you're doing it. We sometimes say to the client, well, I wonder if you could hypothesize what are the other possible outcomes for this dilemma. Would you be willing to consider what might happen if A and B weren't occurring and C and D were options? So you may actually encourage someone in your practice or in your office to be fantasizing with you. Sometimes you might even say, I'm having this fantasy, and what I'm telling myself about what you've just said is, I wonder if we could explore that. And you can make use of it in the skillful sense. And sometimes people just habituate to daydreaming. And it's a good escape temporarily from the pain that they don't know how to navigate. So I don't want to make it a bad or good thing. It's less skillful way to be. But sometimes daydreaming is alleviating just enough pain until the person can generate the skills to experience the pain that they're actually in. So I don't take it away too soon. Do you understand what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. I think also people sometimes make it through a difficult period by remembering they're going on vacation to a beautiful destination. It's like it's building a little stick with itness. I can get through this because in 3 weeks I'm going to this lovely place and I can see the palm trees in my mind. And it's different than my cement jungle here, so they feel a little uplifted by that. So that can be helpful to remind a person that life is larger than the current confines or problems that they're facing. The next one is called memory. And not so great to live in constant rumination or constant memory. Not so great to live in the constant story that what happened was bad or wrong, or what happened has to be corrected, or what happened is the best way that I know how to define myself, so I'm going to keep going on memory. This is what I was told, this is how I got conditioned, this is who I am, this is who I'm going to be, this is like the sentence that I got. In fact, I think Michelle probably knows this study, but I'm not sure if you've been keeping up on studies since you have a new baby. But they were talking recently at a conference I was at about how they had these two groups of children, one of whom was actually the quote-unquote smart group, and the other whom was the quote-unquote not-so-accomplished group. And they didn't tell the teachers which group was which, but they told the students the opposite. They were running a study. So they told the less innately intelligent kids that they actually were really smart and they were capable and they were doing great in school and they're going to go to the next year of school and it's going to be phenomenal what they can learn and how they can grow. And they told the other kids, this is a little heartbreak here, but they told the other kids, you're not doing that well and your accomplishments aren't so extraordinary right now. We need you to work harder and make something of yourself, and we're kind of disappointed. So they didn't tell the kids which group they had been a part of, and they didn't tell the teachers. And the group that got acknowledged as having capacity thrived. And the group that was told how things were about them in the less than fabulous, they didn't thrive. They actually produced the outcome that was expected by the study. So that is to say, if a person's memory is like, this is what I'm limited to, this is how it turned out for me, this is what I was told when I was 5, 8, and 12, and when I was 18 and 25, that's how it's going to unfold. that's a limiting way to live your life. Challenging your experience of memory can feel like you're about to betray your family system or your conditioning or your history. And so it takes some delicacy to challenge that. So I like to turn to the skillful side of memory that allows us to remember and to learn from, not to remember and to shun or be resentful about. And all of us in the room right now have benefited from memory just to get here tonight. Especially if you drove a car. You had to remember certain things. If you walked to the bus stop, you practiced memory until you got there. You sat on the bus, you got off, you practiced memory when you got here. I don't know what you did in between, you might have been daydreaming. And even if you're driving, sometimes people are daydreaming. But you had to use some memory to get yourself into the car, on the roads, and to the destination. So you've already used memory, and it's, like I said, neither good nor bad. It's just that these 5 mind states, the one that's most optimal for experiencing yoga is clear perception, not fantasy or memory. Let's make good use of them, but not get stuck in them. And then there's deep sleep, which also means deep forgetfulness or ignorance. Like deep sleep, like falling into darkness and lethargy. When the mind goes into deep sleep like that, it loses its capacity for freshness and spontaneity and for the benefit of fantasy, and it may also forget the value of memory. And that being said, sometimes deep sleep is just enough mental anesthesia to get a person by until they can find appropriate help or a more wise guide in their life. So as long as it's not the ongoing state of that human, we say it's maybe serving a purpose that you sleep. You have a little, like having a curtain drawn between your life and what you're not able to yet pay attention to. And deep sleep is important for revitalizing your nervous system. So we also need deep sleep and deep rest for the brain to recover. Now, misperception seems like an obviously not good place to live from, right? You might be wondering, how is she going to make the case for skillful misperception? I'm looking at Jay. How am I going to make the case for skillful misperception?
I don't know, I'm waiting with bated breath.
Right. Yeah. What do you guys think? Each one of them has their shadow side, each one has a blessing.
Well, I'm thinking of my grandmother, who was very good at putting a positive spin on a lot of things, but maybe wasn't as skillful at acknowledging the whole truth of things. So you could say that she developed certain misperceptions that served her because they allowed her to believe in a more positive experience than everyone around her was experiencing.
Yeah, she might have been a person of levity, a person with more lightness of heart as a result. Yeah. Yeah, and actually it's similar. Interesting that you said your grandmother, because I was thinking of how children benefit from the story about the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, or the sense that there's a larger and benevolent force in the world that has these fairy creatures that really care about the stages that the child is going through, like losing a tooth or getting excited about Santa Claus is coming and so on. But you all outgrew those fantasies. And I check this with every Dharma talk I give if it comes up. You have outgrown those stories, right? I'm not like bursting your bubble right now. But that bit of misperception, like we know as adults when we're telling the child the tooth fairy's coming, we know that we're making up a character. Well, sometimes having those characters and playing with them is a part of the role of fantasy, and it's not clear perception. We know the tooth fairy doesn't actually exist, but we can use it for a time to encourage playfulness and optimism. Outside of that, misperception becomes things like gossip and misunderstanding, and misperceiving who you are at your very core is what we call avidya, forgetfulness, the most painful experience of being human. So you misperceive that instead of the indwelling love, it's internalized shame. That's not recommended. The 5 kinds of knowing I think that misperception is the most painful. Deep sleep, fantasy and memory, getting stuck in memory, enjoying daydreaming, spending more time in deep sleep, they might be the ways that we distract ourselves from that really painful, internalized, misperceived experience of shame. And thank goodness we have those three. If we can't get to clear perception, we have for a time the anesthetic for the mind and the heart to help us bear our lives long enough until we meet up with our therapist or our guide or our spiritual teacher. Do you understand what I mean by that? There's a temporary season in life. I'm not recommending a permanent use of memory, fantasy, and deep sleep. There's also a therapeutic benefit, and therapists feel free to speak up to this, as to when students or clients misperceive the teacher as always lucid, always compassionate, always giving or generous, like they perceive the teacher's life as having a relative shine to it. There's a benefit to that. If we don't take it on ourselves, you don't put yourself on a particular pedestal about it, but if a student or a client perceives that possibility, even if it's not 100% accurate, what they're perceiving is the possibility that they can also grow towards that. And so I don't dismantle those fantasies or those misperceptions. If somebody has a misperception, I don't try to tear it down abruptly, because what they might be perceiving is how they're growing into that sense themselves. I'm not dishonest. I think I'm relatively transparent. And my life is quite likely more balanced than the average citizen who comes to see me as a yoga client. But I do think that some of that transference and projection can be very helpful for a time, for a season in the therapeutic relationship. Not forever. Not like the Wizard of Oz, right? When you pulled back the curtain and you saw a small creature back there. Would you like to comment on that, Jay?
Well, I agree with that. I don't make an effort to foster such a thing. It seems
Right.
to be inevitable, really, to some extent. It indeed was the primary methodology for Freud, his original theories. But it was not about producing that effect. It was about leveraging the inevitable pattern to move a person out of their pathology. And so that's the way I would think about it. Use transference and projection in very classic psychoanalytic terms in there. And that when you were talking about this, that I was thinking that it has an aspect of the fantasy in that it gives the person it's like wherever the projection puts you, it gives them something to move towards.
Yeah.
And so, hopefully they'll even go like beyond wherever that projection is, or wherever it actually is. That it takes away the limits that don't have another possibility. I oftentimes, in referencing what you said earlier, I oftentimes have encouraged people to create and work with them specifically to create an idea of what it would be like, or what they would be like if they were fill in the blank, if they were being their best version of themselves, if they were free of this emotional burden, whatever it happens to have been. And it's impressively challenging for people to do that. It can go off into the fantasy world, if I won the lottery kind of a thing. But that's not what I'm working towards. I'm working towards them generating an idea of what it would be like. What will they feel like when they are being the way they want to be in the world, for example. So it gives them something to move towards.
Yeah. And so often, let's say the fantasy of if you won the lottery comes with great misperception of what that's going to be like. But the fantasy, what would I be like if I didn't have this particular emotional burden? So probably a more realistic fantasy to work with. Like if this thing were just a little less in my way, what might I experience? The perception of what they could experience is probably a little closer to home, less wrought with the misperceptions of, if I won the lottery and I got married and lived in the Bahamas, what would my life be like? Thank you. Yeah.
You also talk about, when you're a teacher, being, a force or something that your students can anchor to.
Yeah.
And if you're not, I guess, presenting yourself in that calm manner, maybe they misconceive it to be that you're always that way. But if you're not that way in a class, chances are the class won't be a place where they start to unpack, because they're not going to feel as though you have it together, or you, they probably don't want to feel like the blind leading the blind. I mean, sometimes that transparency is nice because you can find commonalities and similarities, and you can connect over a similar experience. But in a teaching situation, you want to feel like you're being taught or guided by someone that has that steadfastness and that steadiness. And if you're not that in class, it's going to be probably less effective as a student.
And similar to what Jay was saying, it's not like we foster misperception. We're not trying to be like a persona as a teacher or a therapist or a guide. But we actually want to show up as the best version of ourselves on behalf of what the student or the clients are needing, and reflecting that potential that we're all growing towards. So you cultivate that in yourself for every time you're teaching or seeing a client or working with a student. And hopefully that's what shines through. You temporarily put aside that which would block that, or that which would make that less likely. And there's a level of authenticity that I think people really want to hook up to. And you can be authentically compassionate, empathetic, sensitive, vulnerable, touched by the experience you're having with a student or a client. But authenticity doesn't then mean we start unpacking our own story with the client or with the class, particularly unresolved material that's not being used to teach the teachings, not being used as a lesson for life.
With the transparency used, I think there's also some utility in that you revealing to someone a different way, as I put it, of relating to the phenomena. So you put something out, if it's presumably you were talking about transparency, putting something about your own stuff, that you have a different relationship with it than they do. So whatever that thing may be, I having changed my relationship to it to be a healthy thing, that's a good modeling, really. It's not the absence of the thing, it's a change in the relationship to it such that it becomes something, again, to move towards. And it's not falseness, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
But it's still something that the person is going to be hooking on that is beyond where they're at. It's going towards something that is not yet, they don't own yet.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, we use imagination a lot in teaching yoga. We also rely on memory. You'll hear some of this tomorrow when I'm teaching asana for you. It's like, can you imagine the spine like a waterfall cascading down from the hips to the crown of the skull in a forward bend, for example? Well, that bit of imagination right there is really helpful for your right brain. It doesn't make sense to your left brain. You're not actually a waterfall. You're a spine with bones and muscles. But to feel that and to import an image from nature, there's a certain tranquility that can overcome the brain and the body at that moment. And we need memory, so the student remembers how to do the specific yoga pose. They don't have to get it perfectly, but they have a sense, like, what's the roadmap here? Without memory of what the pose is, it's difficult to use imagination or fantasy, because they don't feel as secure to then import the fantasy or the imagination. Like, come into, let's say, Sanskrit name pose that you've never heard of before, while imagining yourself as a tiger in the tranquil jungle. If you don't know where you're going, it's really hard to do the imagination part. So we often put those two things together on behalf of the student learning something through the right brain as well as the body, and less analytics from the left brain. And is that okay to add on to what you're saying there? You got it. So in this case, let's say then we go to clear perception, which is the most useful of the 5 mind states. And clear perception is also like lucid, like when the water becomes clear and it's ripple-free. Have you guys had the chance to see some of the glacial lakes here in Oregon, where you can see the sky is reflected in the surface of the water, but equally you can see down towards the bottom of the lake, and it's very clear. We were recently at a lake last summer when we were out camping, and you can see there's the bottom and the stones, and there's the sky and the sun and the clouds all in the same view in the water. So that kind of clarity we call clear perception. It means actually knowing who you are in both your sense of depth and the sense of expansiveness. And water is a good analogy for that, because when the light penetrates that body of water, it shines through towards the bottom where the rocks are. If the water were muddy, it would be altered when it comes through the surface of the water. It would not shine to the bottom. So what happens frequently is that conditioning has caused more muddy water, and even though we're shining love towards a client or a friend or compassion towards the student, the muddiness of the water makes it more difficult for that light to penetrate. So our job is twofold. It's more than that, but for right now it's twofold. One is to shine that possibility on the students or the clients, and the other is to help them make less muddy the water, to unburden the underlying material. One of the ways that immediately unburdens some of that material is empathy. This basic compassion and kindness. We already feel less alone and less made wrong or bad by our circumstances. So if you look at the chart that I have up here, I wrote on the bottom, fantasy, memory, deep sleep, misperception, clear perception. These are the 5 kinds of knowing, and they're sort of under the water here. And then Patanjali tells us that there's 5 states of mind you can experience at any one time. Disturbed, dull, distracted, one-pointed, and lucid. Disturbed mind state is when the thoughts are the most colored. Colored in this case means like the most muddied, the most deeply entrenched, as if you had been soaking dye and cloth for a long time, and you pull the cloth out of the dye and it's really dense color. It's really saturated. So disturbed mind has the most saturation of conditioning and produces the most likelihood of further disturbed mind. Some of that conditioning could just be as deeply rooted as there are bad foods and good foods. I'm speaking because, Annalise, I know you work with eating disorders, as do I, and some people are reading my book, and some of you also are working on lessening dogmatic thinking about such things like good foods and bad foods. But the whole concept that there's a bad food, and that's deeply, deeply entrenched, and absolutely a deep conviction about that, that's a disturbed mind state, because it's a very deeply saturated, colored thought. When that thought becomes less saturated, it's very liberating. You start to lessen the concept of bad and consider the possibility that it's actually not. That takes a gradual awakening of sorts. So the more saturated, the more colored, the more conditioned the thoughts, the more likely they are to be disturbed. Disturbed is the least auspicious mind state, and dull is considered an improvement.
Serge, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking about being physically burdened, which has been my experience most recently, and makes me very empathetic towards people who live with like chronic pain or other things that I can see how in the states of mind I've been in a very distracted state because of that, but I'm having trouble placing it in the other, in the ways of knowing, because it doesn't seem like a misperception.
No, I'd say it's pretty clear that you're carrying extra weight right now. Right. You're about to have a baby.
It could be that you're in a state of clear perception, but also distracted.
Yes, so let me keep going with this analogy, because these 5 things exist as possibilities under the surface of the water. What's the potential shadow side of clear perception? How could clear perception cause disturbance?
Get overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed? Uh-huh. Yeah.
The truth might be very difficult to face.
Yeah. I was actually thinking of how it goes like this. Sometimes a person has clear perception about other people.
Right.
It becomes righteous. It becomes arrogant. It becomes egotistical. It becomes self-aggrandizing. Like, I have clear perception. You're like, to have a yogic insight or a meditative breakthrough, and then to feel like, that's it, I'm here, without actually staying in lucid mind. If you start looking at that person's relationship to themselves, if you feel that when you're near that person it's very disturbing, like the arrogance or righteousness is big, they might have had clear perception about the way of the world. But the way they're expressing it as a human to other humans is causing more disturbance, not more lucidity. So all 5 exist under the surface here for that purpose, that there's a shadow side to each, there's a benefit to each. Does that help some?
Yeah.
So let's say you've lessened the coloring or the saturation of the thought, and now you're just at dull. Why is that an improvement?
It's more manageable.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
murkiness is more steady. The murkiness isn't like have ripples and murk.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, like if you picture the constant stirring of a muddy thing of water and you're always agitating it, it's going to be very likely that you can't see clearly. But if it becomes dull, even like there's a little stagnancy to the water, there is the chance of some reflection. There's the chance of the particles separating just enough that the first few degrees of water become more clear. And a glimpse of your basic nature, your essential nature, is very powerful, and it's valuable even right there. To have a glimpse is more possible if you're dull than if you're disturbed. Dull is also more manageable for the therapist or the yoga teacher to work with. Like to have, it's almost like if you're spinning clay. Have you guys ever spun clay on a wheel? Okay, and if it's off-centered, it's pretty hard to manage, right? But the clay itself, if you get it centered, is inert, it's dull matter. And then you start forming it into something. It becomes a creative process. But if the clay isn't on the wheel properly, you can't make anything of it. So if I have a disturbed or agitated student or client and I actually see them come to dull, like, oh, that's a relief. I'm not working quite so hard. And they're on the center of the wheel, and for a few moments we just coexist. Then we can make something with that process. So what we do in yoga therapy is we're looking at the disturbed person. If it's really rajasic is the word for it, really agitated, we need to down-regulate them. We get to the dull person, we get to nudge them towards capacity. But nudging is also like, I'm going to regulate you towards. And if I take a disturbed person and I'm regulating them towards, like moving in a direction of awakening, the likelihood of that disturbance getting worse is great. So we don't do it, it's premature. So first we stabilize. Let's think of dull as also very stable. Sometimes people land at dull for a long time, but at least they're not disturbed. Yet they can feel afraid of moving in either direction. Moving up the ladder might feel very scary because dull has become very familiar. And the fear that if you go up you might fall down can be great. So we do this quietly. We uncolor thoughts slowly. And the next stage is called distracted. And distracted mind is what most average people are living with. The question is, do your distractions become more dull or more disturbed? What are you doing with that? So distracted is where fantasy, memory, misperception are darting about. We want to take distracted and nudge it towards one-pointed. One of the things I like to say as a clinician is that if I'm primarily working with a distracted mind, I'm close enough to one-pointed that I actually crave getting them in that direction. Because at distracted, we could spend a lot of time circling the possibility. But if we go to one-pointed, we're looking more clearly at the yogic path. The distractions is like circling either the possibility of the drain or the possibility of rising. So when we're at distracted, I celebrate. Oh good, you're only distracted today. Fabulous. We're going to go from distracted towards one point, and we're going to learn to concentrate. Frequently, the thing that brings a person from distracted to one-pointed is their relationship to you and your nervous system. It's not like just lessons that you're going to teach, or like you're going to impart these tools on them. It's really when a person walks into your office or your studio or your classroom and they're coming in with any one of these three, disturbed, dull, or distracted, if they feel your nervous system is available, this is subconscious. I'm not saying that they know it intellectually, but there's a sense they could line up with the ease with which you're sitting. Distracted can move to one-pointed more easily. That's where you get to play the role of what I like to call the lighthouse. The ocean might be stormy, that's disturbed. The ocean might be stagnant, that's dull. The ocean might be just a little bumpy, like distracted, but the lighthouse is still beaming a clear light. If your nervous system is disturbed, but you have a facade of being steady, sensitive students and clients will know that. And you'll find you're trying to get them to one point, but they can't arrive. The good question to ask is, what am I contributing here as a provider, as a practitioner, as a lighthouse? Do you follow what I'm saying there? It's okay.
And is it okay to be transparent then, and in order to kind of reveal why your nervous system may be disturbed or dull, and just share in your humanity? And
I wouldn't recommend that.
No.
No. You know, I love the concept of shared humanity, and I'll talk about that as the training goes on, and I'll unpack it for you many times. But I wouldn't recommend saying to the client, you know what, I just got really bad sleep last night. And so I'm having a hard time staying awake right now in this session. Or, you know, I got really bad news about such and such, and the house I thought I was going to buy, the other person got it, and I'm just really jealous and overwhelmed, and like, you know, I know we got to get started here in a couple minutes with your appointment, but I just got to get this off my chest so that I can be present with you. I know you're not saying that specifically, but I wouldn't recommend, no. Rather, I recommend that you have a quality of loyalty to the nervous system that best provides for your client and your student. And do your optimal best to be more at one pointed or lucid when they're coming in to see you. The tools that we use for the student or the client are the same ones we're going to use for ourselves. And I said before, one of the best ways to sort of less muddy the water is to come immediately to empathy. Well, you can practice self-empathy. We might call that self-compassion, while still upholding the best version of yourself as a yoga therapist or a clinician or a psychotherapist. Mm-hmm. You want to add to that?
That sounds about right. From my perspective, I agree with that. I guess one simple way to put it is that I practice what I teach. You know, if I already know before I know when that morning before I even leave my house what's going to be going on, if something's going on in me. So if my head's not where I think it's going to be good, I tend to it before I get there. It's not really. I'm very present and very personal, genuine, real person in the room with my clients.
Mm-hmm.
You would never get the sense that I was aloof or distanced with clients whatsoever. But that doesn't mean I'm going to be using them to be my therapist, or that the state of whatever's going on in my life, somehow I have a right to diminish what I'm going to provide for them because of what's going on in my life, either. So I tend to my own house first, rather than necessarily share it.
Mm-hmm. And a remarkable thing is that you become just more steady and empathetic as a person. It grows you. It's really so nourishing to know these are your responsibilities, but it's also your honor and your privilege that you assign to yourself by taking on the role. But it really does grow you. Yeah. So moving from one-pointed, if we can find the steadiness there, often lucid naturally occurs. I like to say lucid is actually magnetically pulling us towards that possibility. Have you ever had the experience of just feeling suddenly, unconditionally contented, expansive, or like in love with the world? Has this happened? Mm-hmm. Did you say no? Oh, it has happened. Yeah, and so when that was occurring, why did it happen? Because you got your way, or? Meditation is oriented for everything. Yeah, the answer in part one was sartorius. Which is the name of a muscle. It's a muscle. For those who don't know, that's Latin for this muscle right here, sartorius. Now the answer is going to be for part two, meditation. The answer for everything is meditation when the teacher asks a question. But why did it occur? Was it good luck?
Yeah.
Sometimes, right. Sometimes it's this confluence of good luck. You don't realize it just occurred. Now, once it occurs, it haunts you. You want to have the experience again, right? So even if the disturbed person had a haunt for a moment, they had like this blissful equanimity for a little glimpse, that pulls them to want it again. And the dull person, the water got a little still, a little bit of clarity on the top, and they might get a glimpse. And that haunts you to want more of that which we call in yoga ananda, that bliss, that sense of contentment or being held by love. It haunts you to want more. The distracted person also wants it. What happens right here at distracted, which can pull us to dull and disturbed so often, is that distracted is where materialism and consumerism and marketing come in. They say, we know you want that thing, that feeling that's haunting you, that feeling that we can give you with a shiny new refrigerator or whiter teeth or better dishwashing soap. We've got it right here, packaged. You too can have it. So we're being lured all the time. Something in our own human family, we discovered this, that we can lure ourselves into desire for something more bright, beautiful, expansive, loving. We've just usurped it to do marketing and commercialism and materialism. Do you understand what I mean by that? But you've got that haunt already going. You have a craving for it, and it's actually pulling you in that direction. So when you get more concentrated, more one-pointed, the haunt is closer. The magnet is stronger. So it actually pulls you into lucid. And you can watch this on the face of a client or student you're working with, where awe comes over them. And they were only practicing mindfulness or breathing to get more still and concentrated, and then it occurred. They said, whoa, that thing happened. We see this so often with new students, particularly in our rehab classes and with my eating disorder students, that they get that glimpse and it happened to me. It also happened to me. It's not just a story I heard about. It's something that can happen. So the closer you get to lucid, the more magnetically it's pulling on you. Right? And at that time, let's say that you're having a lucid moment, really expansive, like just feeling that life is love and yoga is equanimity in action, and somebody says, well, what about your bad food, good food list? Does that feel so believable at that moment? No. No. What about your bad person, good person list? Does that still feel so believable? No, because the thoughts got less colored. They have less grab on you right there. There's actually a biochemical event happening when this goes on. And that's one of the good things about modern research, is that it can point to why does that happen? What is the neurological biochemical event that's occurring that feels like love and grace and is consciousness itself? It's very healing to be able to taste that aspect, that essence of who we are. And to realize the most colored thoughts don't seem so colored anymore, right there. Often a person experiences this in your company, when you're teaching, when you're holding space for that to happen, or we experience it in each other's company. Then we walk back out into the world that's colored with thoughts. It's conditioned. It may be heavily conditioned. And we feel we lose that lucid experience. We actually aren't losing it. It's the most indwelling thing. We may be forgetting it. We may feel the burden of disturbed or dull or getting colored or heavy again. We may have the inclination to stir our own pot because feeling lucid is uncomfortable. We may have the inclination for really deep sleep because dull is easier than lucid. When we walk out into society that says we're all meant to be distracted, dull, and disturbed, not one-pointed and lucid. That was an important statement I made right there, so let me restate it. You may feel lucid or one-pointed, but when you walk back out into society that's conditioned for distracted, dull, and disturbed, it might feel too uncomfortable to stay at lucid. And we go to our comfort zone, which could be disturbed or dull again, or distracted. And it's really important, I like Jay's, he uses this word, it's important to inoculate people as to the possibility of that occurring, and that doesn't make them failures at yoga, or at therapy, or at realization, nor are they failing at having an insight simmer. It's just that sometimes holding the insight in a body-centered way, we don't have it so deeply rooted yet, and it's more vulnerable. So we walk out into the world and we ask, with who are we going to keep company? What are we going to expose ourselves to? Like, what magazines, what TV programs, what radio stations, what kind of companions. Because when you have that lucid thing and it's early in its development, it's a little bit vulnerable. It, as its own thing, is very powerful, but our connection to it may seem vulnerable, so we have to protect and cherish that. And I find it really important to educate, inoculate the student or the client about that possibility. I remember in my own life development, there was a significant turning point where I had this realization that joy wasn't coming and going from me. I was coming and going from it. I was causing the coming and going. It wasn't the other way around. This, in my own sense of clear perception, is also true for you. Depending on how much misperception you have about yourself, you're not believing me right now, or you are believing me. Would you like to say anything from my sidekicks here? So the question is like, how do we uncolor the thoughts? How do you uncolor conditioning? How do you lessen its saturation?
Meditation.
Thank you. Sartorius and meditation. Yeah. Well, one of the roles we have as yoga teachers and yoga therapists and clinicians is that we are engaged in this process ourselves, so that when someone comes to sit with us, however deeply colored their thoughts are, they aren't as believable to us. We don't share that deep coloring of their thoughts. I imagine you face this at the Oregon Hospital quite a lot. Like the conditioning there is also biochemical, and based on my experience with what Carrie told me she was working with, some of it's so deeply entrenched, and other people have labeled and institutionalized on top of that it's very hard to change that coloring. But if we as practitioners aren't believing the deep coloring and saturation, if we see rather the indwelling love, the indwelling sense of belonging and kindness, we're already helping to lessen the coloring of thoughts. We have to be that clear ourselves.
I just recently talked to a student who came in and said, yeah, I'm here to do that stupid training, my physical, working with a trainer. And I said, wow, aren't you lucky to be strong enough to be able to work with this trainer? So she, within a week, seeing her within a week, she goes, that changed my whole vision, because I didn't believe how, it is a bummer you have to work out with a trainer. That sucks.
Yeah.
Instead it was, wait a minute, what an opportunity
Yeah.
to be able to do that. And I said, but you have a choice, so you don't have to do it. Where would you head if you didn't?
Right.
So that's, you're doing it, so that's you're lucky to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Or don't do it. Head in that direction.
For those of you who are familiar with Buddhism at all, I make it synonymous with coloring as the principle of attachment. And so attachment and non-attachment, coloring and non-coloring, so to speak, uncoloring. To me, that's what that is.
Yeah. Tomorrow's discussion is on attachment and non-attachment, actually, at 10 a.m. It's on Abhyasa and Vairagyam, which is really, that's the recommendation that's next made in the Yoga Sutras, is so you have this going on, how are you going to uncolor thoughts? Well, first and foremost, we as providers are going to see the indwelling potential of the student or the client. We want to see that experience of love or grace, whatever you'd like to name it. And then we're going to teach them how to witness what is occurring, to disturb it less often, and to make it less dull. So if it's disturbed, witnessing helps to calm it down. We're just a little separated, a little bit of a buffer between the disturbed mind and our ability to witness it. If we go to dull, so we have many sedimentary layers now all stacked on top of each other, and they can become very hardened. To witness that is witnessing, and it starts to lessen how stuck together it is. So sedimentary layers start separating and you can see through them by just witnessing, simply witnessing. Then you go to distracted, and as you're witnessing distracted, it's like watching, oh, that's what the human mind does. This is what mental conditioning does when it's distracted. Rather than overly identifying, that's what I do when I'm distracted, you can change the pronoun in the sentence. That's what it does. That's what it does when it's dull. That's what it does when it's disturbed. I'm experiencing the human condition as it shows up with my own mind patterns. I'm not alone with that. I'm not unique in that. My story might feel unique to me, but the way the patternings are is not that unique. That helps to lessen the isolation a person feels about their circumstance. And witnessing helps them to do that. And once you realize that these thought clusters are not yours alone uniquely and painfully showing up, it lessens the coloring of them. Because now they exist in the big human soup of thought patterns. So they're already less saturated by that. And then you start witnessing when you're practicing one-pointed awareness, wow, that's really phenomenal. It can pay attention. I'm paying attention through this process. After witnessing, and our job with witnessing the student or the client, then we have to practice what's called abhyasa and viragyam. And the cool thing about that in yoga is that these two things coexist. Intense, focused effort and utter non-attachment. Like intense, focused effort to uncolor the thoughts with absolute surrender and non-attachment. Like, how do those two things coexist? We'll talk about that tomorrow because it's like a little bit of a Zen koan. I'll be leaving you with it tonight. But to understand that there are tools you apply to the circumstances. First and foremost is how we see ourselves and the client or the student. Any other comments right now about uncoloring thoughts before I give you the translation? Let me ask you this question. Are you aware of some thoughts that you've outgrown? Might you be willing to say what they are? They might have been really dense or saturated at one time before, but now you've outgrown them and they're like dandelion puffs, like poof. This goes like that. How about this thought? Did you ever have this one? Constant busyness is a good idea. Have you outgrown it? Do you still find yourself doing it though? Like, this is, yeah. So here's the thing about some of these circumstances. You can actually uncolor the thought, and the mind is much lighter than the body. So the density of physical habit can still end up here. So one of the things you have to also inoculate students or clients about is you might have this realization and really get that I outgrew this thought. There I am standing at the fridge, still doing the thing. Or there I am with my calendar, still making the same pattern. Because the neurological, physiological, musculoskeletal act was very strong for a long time. So when the thought is less colored, we have to let it really sink into, become absorbed by the body also. But what are some other thoughts that you outgrew that you think, wow, I once lived with that. Now it's a dandelion puff. Yes?
Being single means I'm less than everyone else in the world. I've outgrown that thought.
Amen. That's great.
But it sometimes creeps back in.
Yeah, because again, you live in society where there's conditioning.
Yeah.
And you also had body memory of that thought for a long time, but you're outgrowing. It's still valid. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I used to drink a lot and do drugs. And I used to wake up every single morning dreading and thinking and trying to decide, well, what did I do? Because I can't remember anything. And for a long time, it took me a long time to wake up and not have dread, real dread, honest to goodness dread. I quit drinking and quit using drugs, and it took me years to literally wake up and not feel like I had done something wrong the night before. And now I don't feel like that anymore. Thank goodness. I feel happy to wake up and happy to be me. It took me a long time. I literally, and then seeing police officers while I was driving. It took me a long time to realize I wasn't doing anything wrong. Oh my God, there's the cops. I'm not doing anything wrong. Okay.
That's a good example also of when your neurological system is a very fast operating system. So you see the cop and you get a hot flash. And maybe now today you see the cop, there's no hot flash. Because you further uncolor the thought, you've outgrown the thought cluster. Yeah. Yeah. How about anybody who's outgrown the deeply colored cultural thought that you should count calories so you know how many you're taking in and how many you're burning? Have you outgrown that one? Amen, right. So it's a misunderstanding now. That's not how the metabolism works, and it's not best science for us. Or how about outgrowing the thought altogether that your body composition determines your worth? How's that one going?
Much better.
A practice you can use with students or clients when they have a sense like, am I going to make progress? Am I not making progress? Am I falling behind? Am I regressing? Is to ask, well, and what things have you outgrown? What are some of those deeply saturated thoughts that you once lived by that ruled how you organized your day or your mind or your relationships, and you actually have outgrown them? Certainly there are some. And remembering what those are, that's a practice. It's sort of a cognitive practice, but it can also become the realization that your body also outgrew some of those thoughts. That's really empowering for giving us hope that we could outgrow other deeply colored or saturated thoughts. Of course, the most deeply entrenched one I refer to often is the internalized sense of shame, which yoga calls avidya, forgetting your basic nature, being ignorant as to who you deeply, deeply are. So when we look at outgrowing certain thoughts, you already lessened your attachment to some of those. And it probably took a little bit of practice or deliberateness of effort to outgrow it. Sometimes we got lucky and we had a blazing shock of insight, and we stabilized in that insight. Often if we had the blazing insight and we stabilized in it, we had the resource of other humans who could reinforce the insight. We are not independent, we are social brains needing social support to help us stabilize and to grow. So it's said here, and this is Swami Rama's translation, he's referring to klishta and aklishta, means the colored and the uncolored. And there are some word pairs that you can look at as part of the translation, and I'll leave you with this tonight, to ask of yourself about your most beloved thoughts, the ones that are still deeply saturated, the ones that you even know they cost you vitality because they put you in distracted, dull, or disturbed states. You can ask of yourself, are these thoughts painful or not painful? Not useful or useful? Afflicted or not afflicted? Impure or pure? Troubled or not troubled? So you can ask yourself the question. I think it's a really good way to help us relate to thought. So that's like, now I'm having a relationship with my own mind pattern, so I'm witnessing it, but I'm also going to ask this question about my relationship to it. Is this a painful or unpainful thought? Is this a troubled or untroubled thought? Is it skillful or not skillful? Is it useful or not useful? This is on page 10 in your manual. Is it kind or unkind, the thought I'm having? I'm not much for dogmatic thinking, but I think sometimes you actually have to ask the question in this way, and it disarms your attachment to the thought, the most deeply colored thoughts. I have to say, I'm working in a Renaissance time here at the Department of Corrections. It's so phenomenal to be with the officers. And I'm in the institution that I first walked into in 1998 when I walked in to help inmates, and I'm working with officers. And to hear the care and concern they have for the persons in custody, who they call clients, to hear their care and concern for that person's life to unfold in a better manner is really, it's like a renaissance to me. It's so inspiring and astounding. There's been a significant thought culture change in the, I can't really even call it the criminal justice system. I don't know what to call it. In the correctional system, which it's not really the right word either, but do you understand what I mean? In the prison system, there's such significant change. And how the officers are seeing that for the clients, the persons in custody, when I'm working with them, which was yesterday morning, I'm now working with them on looking at that perspective change about themselves. Because one of the things that they've done is prioritized the care and compassion towards the persons in custody at the expense of themselves. So now we're asking, and how can you turn this process on yourself. Ask of your own thought. When you walk into the institution and you're all about helping the other at your own expense, is this a skillful or unskillful thought? Is this going to cause resilience or lack of resilience? Is this a painful way to be or an unpainful way to be? So we pose the question. It seems relatively obvious. If you walk in and you forget to hydrate, you forget to take a break, you have no time for mindfulness at your desk, it's all about protecting the people in custody. If you walk in and you're self-negating all day long, it's pretty obvious that's a painful thought. That's an unskillful thought. It's not a useful thought. But the culture that they work in is so deeply steeped in, you don't care for yourself, you care for the team, and you care for the people in custody. You look out for yourself so you don't get harmed, but you don't look out for yourself like your well-being. You look out for yourself like your guarded self. So for me to be in the circumstance watching thought culture transformation there is very inspiring, and I believe we're all capable of it. Our thoughts can become less colored, and we can experience more lucidity and grace. That was a Cliff Notes version of my experience at the Department of Corrections. Do you have any questions about that? Or did I say it clearly enough you understand the circumstance? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you feel inspired by it? Mm-hmm. Like little goosebumps come up your arms? Wow. Change is possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything to add? Okay, let's on that note then, acknowledging that we are also capable of that kind of uncoloring and transformation. Let's sit for a few minutes of quiet together to hope for the possibility of lucid, less colored, more open, expansive mind and heart. You can make your seat comfortable. For a moment, you can acknowledge memory that you've outgrown some thoughts, some deeply colored thoughts. And give a little nod to imagination or fantasy that you can see yourself actively continuing to become more lucid, more clear. And give a moment's awareness to the practice of witnessing, whether your mind is disturbed, dull, distracted, or one-pointed. Practice witnessing what's occurring, understanding that what is occurring is a part of human mind conditioning. And with appreciation for the processes of yoga and the chance that we had to come together, please join your hands in Anjali Mudra. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.